Right, we should be getting a message soon. All right, everybody, welcome. Good evening. Thank you, everyone, for joining us for the last installment of our annual Seminario series. My name is Ricardo Alvarez. I'm an assistant professor here at Baylor University. Very happy to be here with Dr. Julia Young, a longtime friend and colleague of not just myself, but also the network. And very excited to hear a little bit more about her work titled The Princess and the Priest, Mexican Monarchists and the U.S. Catholic Clergy. We're really excited to have Julia here. I'm going to go ahead and introduce her. She's going to give us a brief PowerPoint presentation, tell us a little bit more about this work. I believe from reading the work myself, she also has some questions for us in the audience about how this might fit into her current project on Sinarquismo. Perhaps that's something that she'd like for us to discuss together, or if this is something that could be more of a standalone or the beginnings of another project down the road. But I'm going to go ahead and introduce Julia first, and then I'll go ahead and let her take it away. So Dr. Julia Young is a historian of migration, Mexico and Latin America, and Catholicism in the Americas. Her prize-winning book, Mexican Exodus, Immigrants, Exiles, and Refugees of the Cristero War, examines Mexican religious exiles, political refugees, and labor immigrants in the United States during Mexico's Cristero War. She co-edited Local Church, Global Church, Catholic Activism in Latin America from Rerum Novarum to Vatican II. She has also published scholarly articles in the Americas, the Catholic Historical Review, Mexican Studies, Modernism, and the Journal on Migration and Human Security. Dr. Young has been a fellow at the Klug Center at the Library of Congress, as well as the Institute for Policy Research at Catholic University. In 2020 and 21, she was a fellow at the Luz ACLS program in Religion, Journalism, and International Affairs. And she's currently researching a new book about right-wing Catholicism in Mexico during the 20th century, frequently writing for the media about immigration, border issues, and Catholic migration history. So thank you, Julia, again, for being here with us. Again, the title of the presentation is The Princess and the Priest, A Tale of Mexican Monarchists and the U.S. Catholic Clergy. Thank you.
Thank you, Ricardo. And hi, everyone. It's wonderful to see you all. And I'm so grateful to especially those of you who are teaching and in the semester that is the longest semester in the history of semesters and wrapping up your work. So I'm grateful to you all for being here. And I've been excited about this. I'm very excited to share with you what's really, I was playing with the title and I called this originally A Tale of Mexican Monarchists and the U.S. Catholic Clergy. This is really just a story. And it's a story that I don't think I'm not the first to uncover this story. I think I'm trying to put it to put elements of the story together in a new way. And so I'm trying to figure out what to do with this story. So what I thought I would do tonight is tell you the story and show you some of the pretty pictures that I've found and documents that I've found in uncovering parts of the story and pulling other uncovered parts of it together, and then ask you for advice on what to do with this story, what this story means. And so it might not be the most coherent or cohesive story, but I think it's a fun one. The first time I presented this, or the only other time I presented this, was back in October, and it was to an audience that was not familiar, largely not familiar with Mexican history. And so some of this is going to be a sort of review of elements of Mexican history that this audience is going to know quite well. But I think parts of it will be also new. So I hope it will be of interest. I have about 30 slides-ish, and I've told Ricardo that I will go for no more. I asked for 20 minutes. So I'm going to put on my timer, and Ricardo, you can stop me or just tell me to wrap it up, and I will get right to the end. And I'll try to go through some of these images fairly quickly, and we can go back to them if we want to. So I'm going to share my screen so you can all see the flyer from, and now I can't see any of you. Oh, I sort of can see you. Okay, great. So here we go. When I gave this to the audience of non-Mexican specialists, I had to introduce this person who I think most of you know who he is quite well, right? Agustín de Iturbide, Mexico's first emperor, And the moment he represents is Mexico's first empire, which, again, for an audience of non-Mexican specialists, people don't really realize that Mexico has this history of being briefly a monarchy after its independence. And of course, Iturbide is the self-styled emperor and for a while official emperor of Mexico, who promised the three guarantees of religion. Mexico, the Catholic Church remains the official religion of Mexico, union, that equal rights for Mexicans born in Mexico and Spain, and independence, separation from Spain. And he is crowned in 1822, and he abdicates in 1823. So his empire is very short. And you all know also how the story of his empire ends. He is executed on July 19th, 1824. So it's a brief moment in Mexican history, and not enough to make us necessarily think of it the first time we think of Mexican history, but it's important for this story. So Iturbide dies quite early on in his empire, or after a very short period. But his wife, Ana Maria Josefa de Huarte, stays alive, and the two of them had eight children eight children who survived to adulthood. I think they had 9 or 10 children in total. And after his death, she went into exile into the United States. She mostly stayed in Philadelphia. And in fact, that is where she and some of her children are buried. And their second son, Agustin, and his wife's second son, was a man named Ángel de Iturbide y Huarte. He was born in 1816 and he lived until 1872, and he was raised largely in exile in the United States. As an adult, he served as an attaché for the Mexican embassy in Washington, D.C. And when he was there, he met and married a woman named Alice Green, who was herself from a kind of distinguished Washington family. She was the descendant of a former governor in Maryland and a Revolutionary War general, and she grew up. And again, I was giving this presentation in DC. Well, I'm here in the DC area now. So she grew up in a place that locals know. It's called Rosedale. It's a beautiful old farmhouse. It's still standing on what was then a really sprawling estate in the neighborhood of Cleveland Park, if any of you have been there. So this elite Washingtonian woman and this Mexican son of a deposed and assassinated emperor who was raised in exile get married to each other. And they, after their marriage, move to Mexico and they have a baby. And that baby is named Agustin de Iturbide y Green. So the Green comes from his mother, Alice Green, and he is named for his assassinated grandfather. And he's born in the year 1863. So you all know what is happening in Mexico at that time. This is the beginning of, he is born right around the time of the Second Empire in Mexico, where after 40 politically unstable years after Mexico's independence, Mexican conservatives ally with occupying French forces and install a second imperial government in Mexico. They select Maximilian, a Habsburg son of Archduke Franz Karl of Austria, and they invite him to Mexico in 1864. So this is a dramatic story that I know you all know. You know, there are books about it. I think there's a play. There's a movie that I'll tell you about in a minute. And one of the reasons it's such a dramatic story is because what is this Habsburg emperor doing installed in a new second monarchy in Mexico, right? This is a really contentious issue, and there are, right from the beginning, a tremendous number of questions about the legitimacy of this second empire. And so Carlota and Maximilian and Carlota live in Mexico's Chapultepec Castle, and they attempt to legitimize their empire, right? And anyone who's been to the museum in Chapultepec Castle has seen all the trappings of empire that they accumulated while there. And one of the trappings that they didn't have, that they needed, was an heir, a child. And so Carlota they were unable to have children together. And so they went looking for a suitable heir. And they found him in the young Agustin de Iturbide y Green, who was at the time 3 years old and living in Mexico City. He may have been 2.5, 3 years old, living in Mexico City, and conveniently had the same name as the first Mexican emperor, and was his direct descendant, the son of his second son. His first son didn't have children. So, under lots and lots of pressure from Maximilian and Carlota and their entourage, Alice Green basically, it was up to her, but she decided to surrender her son to Maximilian, deposit him in the castle of Chapultepec, where he went to live with as the presumed heir of the Second Empire. Um, she regretted that decision. His mother regretted that decision almost immediately. Maximilian exiled them right after she surrendered her child. They returned home to Washington. Alice lobbied during that time, during the next year or so, lobbied incessantly for her son's return. She even traveled to France to ask the Emperor Louis Napoleon III to intercede, to no avail. But we also know how the Second Empire ended. It fell in 1867, and Maximilian is executed. And just before that, he had a sense that he knew things were going badly, and they sent the young heir, the Agustin Iturbide Green, off to Havana, and he was picked up by his relieved mother. So here he is as a young man. He goes back to his father died, I think shortly after this. He goes back to Washington, D.C. He lived in the Georgetown neighborhood, grew up very Catholic. I think I forgot to mention that Alice Green was from a Catholic family and was Catholic herself. Received a Catholic education at Georgetown, and then in Europe. And in 1884, he goes back to Mexico at age 18, and he does his military service. And his trip back to Mexico his return to Mexico is very widely covered in the Mexican press and in the international press, right? And he is very much covered as the young heir of Agustin de Iturbide, has returned to Mexico. He's doing his military service. He's a patriot, and there's speculation, particularly in the international press, about what does this mean? Is he the once and future king? That kind of thing. So in 1890, he's in his mid-20s at this point, I think. No, maybe even 30. He writes a sort of, probably in a bad move. He decides to write a critical article criticizing the regime of Porfirio Diaz, and he is thrown in prison. And his imprisonment is also covered widely in the Mexican and international press. It's really this dramatic event. This once and future king is thrown in prison, and it's covered in El Hijo de Ahuizote. I have it here just because I thought it would be entertaining for us, but it's really covered as, is this the final death knell of Mexico's monarchy, right? This young, handsome soldier who maybe could have been a return of the Mexico's monarchy is thrown in prison. And so it is the tumba de la monarquía, as you can see here. So that is the end thanks to his mother, Alice Green, and her, again, incessant lobbying, Agustin Iturbide Green is released from prison in Mexico, and he goes back to his adopted home his childhood home in Washington, D.C. And eventually he loses his fancy Rosedale estate, and he ends up kind of in a distinguished poverty in DC. He settles into a house with a Catholic DC family. He becomes a devout and regular parishioner at Holy Trinity Catholic Church, which is the oldest Catholic church in Washington, DC. Kind of becomes an integral or well-known member of DC's Catholic society. And he's, by all accounts, a devout Catholic. He goes to Mass all the time. Friends think that he might take holy vows. His Catholic identity is very important to him. And he doesn't take holy vows. And here's where our princess comes into the story. Instead, he meets a woman named Louise Kearney, also from a prominent Catholic family in Georgetown. They meet, they flirt, they marry. She has a twin sister. Her twin sister's really angry that I guess she had a crush on Augustine and feels that like her sister stole her man. And there's family drama. Her family objects, and they actually cut her off. But so she doesn't have her wealth. He doesn't have his wealth. They live in a tiny little apartment in DuPont Circle in DC. But according to her, they have a blissfully happy marriage. They're both older when they get married. They're in their 40s, and they never have children. And they live in an apartment surrounded by the memorabilia of his time in Mexico and his family's documents and his family's memorabilia. So Agustin de Iturbide dies in 1925. His wife, Louise Kearney, I think I didn't say her name before, sorry. This is the princess, Louise Kearney, never remarries. And she lives in that apartment and preserves it. She keeps it almost like a museum to Iturbide. It's filled with furniture and books and pictures. And I have a couple pictures of that. She gets she's sort of no one really knows about her until in 1939 the movie Juarez is released. It's on YouTube. I really encourage you to watch it. It has Betty Davis in it and or Bette Davis. I'm not sure how actually you pronounce her name. And it tells the dramatic story of Maximilian and Carlota, and the little boy emperor is actually featured for a couple minutes in the film. And when that movie's released, some reporters realized that this princess, the widow of this prince of Mexico, is living right here in Washington, D.C. And they go to visit her, and they write, and she shares her. So here she is. She's older at this point, 1939, and she shares her old photos and she shares her memories, and they write down the story. And this brings her to the attention. And here is where I'm bringing two stories together. This brings her to the attention of a dashing, handsome, globe-trotting priest who is, by that point, a professor at the Catholic University of America. He starts working there in 1940, and he eventually becomes, like all good professors, eventually, well, like many professors, not always good, goes into administration, and eventually becomes like the number three position in the university. And he's known for leading these world tours around in Latin America and then eventually around the world, specifically for Catholics. And he gets his start on these world tours, and then he comes back and he gives lectures about them to Catholic audiences. He sort of interprets what's going on in the world for Catholic audiences at Catholic University and then in DC. He gets his start traveling, going to Mexico. And he first had gone there in the 1930s. And when he went there as a Catholic priest, he was introduced to Mexican Catholics who had been involved in the conflicts in the 1920s and 30s that this audience knows about so well, and I don't need to explain. And he is very, very sympathetic because of those visits to Mexican Catholics, to the victims of the Catholic victims of the Mexican church state conflict, and to their narratives about the history of Mexico and the injustices done by the revolution to the Mexican Catholic Church, and the veneration that Mexican Catholics have for Agustin de Iturbide. And he writes in 1942 a book called Men of Mexico, in which he tells Iturbide's story sort of factually, but also very sympathetically. He laments that his assassination led to, quote, unprogressive feudalism under the rules of the liberals. And reform has followed the way of civil strife and violence. So he knew who Iturbide was. At some point, he meets this princess, this sort of Miss Havisham-like princess in her apartment in DC. She's a very religious Catholic, so I'm guessing that she meets him at Catholic University or in church or at one of his talks that he gives in DC. And they begin a correspondence with each other that by 1959, at least, gets very intimate. She calls him Father Mine. She signs her letters, Your Child Louise. And he actually connects her to some of the descendants of Agustin de Iturbide, or the relatives of her deceased husband, who are living in Mexico City. And he actually brings her on tours to Mexico City and introduces her to this family. I think some of them she may have known by correspondence. May have met the ones in Philadelphia before, but it's Magner that really connects her to that sort of network um, of I don't know, imagined royalty in Mexico City. Um, and in 1957, he arranges for her to donate some very important documents that she has, in particular, an original copy of the Plan de Iguala, which is, I don't need to explain to this crowd either, but they described as Mexico's Declaration of Independence, and they viewed as a really important foundational document to Mexican history, and also a testament to the centrality of the Catholic Church, and also a symbol of the sort of tragic history of the Mexican Catholic Church and Mexican Catholics. And so here she is with with dignitaries of the university. I'm blanking on the name of the bishop, but I believe it wasn't called the president of the university at that time. It's the bishop in charge of the university with the Mexican flag, and Father Magner on the left. And she's quite old at this point. And they have a very sort of ceremonial event um, uh, where they play music and they have food, and they have a reception afterwards, and they have all kinds of honorary remarks. So there now I'm going to conclude in the next 2 minutes, and I'm going to jump to 2019 when I was by then a faculty member at Catholic University, and I worked closely with the Catholic University archives. And through my colleagues there, I knew that the Plan de Iguala was at Catholic University and was in fact, one of our sort of most treasured objects in the archives. And someone from the archives reached out to me and said, we have this group of Mexican monarchists, and they want to have an event where we display the Plan de Iguala. What do you think about that? And I said, well, let me know how I can help. And they said, well, can you make remarks putting the Plan de Iguala in context? So there I am. It's before the pandemic, so I'm a lot younger in every way, and giving remarks on what the Plan de Iguala meant at the time, and then what it meant for Mexican Catholics in the 1920s. I wrote in my book and dissertation about Mexican cristeros who referred to themselves as the army of the Trigarante, the Trigarante army, the army of the three guarantees, right? It's how they were very much remembering and associating themselves with that tragic story of empire and with Iturbide. And this group of monarchists came, and the primary thing that happened at that event is that they actually really kind of venerated the Plan de Iguala. It was really a kind of remarkable moment where they read parts of it, they sang the national anthem, they remarked on how this was a foundational document for Mexican history, which, as you know, is very different from the sort of mainstream narratives of Mexican history. Later, the same group brought back a woman who was the mayor of the town of Cordoba, someone who will have to remind me, I think in the state of Puebla, who came and looked at all the documents that we have. You can see the photo that I showed, and made the statement that these documents should really come back to Mexico, that they really belonged in Mexico. And at that point, we did some research, and we learned that or we reiterated, I guess, the archives reiterated that the documents had been donated by Louise Kearney on the condition that they never be returned to Mexico. Because, as you can imagine, she had some grudges against the Mexican government for its treatment of her husband's grandfather and her husband. And so we still keep those documents there today. We haven't heard from any Mexican monarchist recently, but we are ready and happy to have them come and have an excuse to take out all these documents and memorabilia. The last thing that I will just conclude with is that this story of the Mexican monarchy and the ways that it has persisted in a certain way up until the present day is I don't know what it means. It's the number of Mexican monarchists is surely quite small. But there are still, if we go into the digital world, there are still sort of significant channels, social networks, I don't know, accounts on social media that are interested in keeping track of the Iturbide family and even reviving the Mexican monarchy. So you can go onto TikTok and you can look for Iturbide and you can see these kind of videos that are promoting the Iturbide legacy, the monarchy of Mexico, and these memories. And then this last one, a lot of them will have these maps. I think there was a lot of them will have these maps of Mexican territory under the Mexican Empire, which of course was much larger. And so they end up converging in certain ways into this fantasy of a larger reclaimed Mexican territory that is led by an emperor. So I'll just conclude with um, the last paragraph of this paper, if you don't mind, Ricardo. It just take me a minute to read. Um, I said, what to make of the story of Mexico's American-born princess, her tragically short marriage, and her friendship with the globe-trotting Catholic priest. If this history can tell us anything, it reveals that Mexican monarchists and their allies have existed and persisted on both sides of the border for more than 2 centuries after the country's independence from Spain. In doing so, they have outlasted all of their enemies, Santa Anna, Juarez, Porfirio Diaz, the Revolution, and even Mexico's long dominant political party, the PRI. Certainly, this is enough to let them dream that there is a future in which one day Mexico's monarchists attract a constituency and replace the current political system. In this dream scenario, shared by Catholic monarchists outside of the country as well, Mexico's empire might rise once again. So I end with that. It's a little bit meant as a comedic note. I don't think we're in any danger of Mexico's monarchy rising once again, although I guess as a historian, I probably shouldn't make predictions about the future. And thank you for looking at my pictures. And now please tell me what the story means.
Thank you, Julia. We'll give you a virtual hand. Thank you. That was great. That was fantastic. And I really do appreciate having the visuals on the PowerPoint because they look so much better than my printout copy that I have here next to me.
Good.
So as I mentioned earlier, my questions are pretty short, brief, short and sweet, and just trying to get into like the very basics, the who, what, when, and where of the story that you're telling. Because I did find this connection really intriguing, not surprising in many ways. Having done some research myself on groups like the Knights of Columbus, I mean, there's a lot of monarchical tendencies, in the way that they're picturing Mexico and writing about leaders like Iturbide. And you mentioned someone like Francis Kelly, right? He comes up in your paper, and those of us who have done this work, we know that, he's also doing quite a bit of reading and writing and translating, Mexican Catholic history and such among U.S. church circles. But so I guess that kind of sets me up for kind of my first question, which is more about the who of the story, because to me, more than a tale or a story of Mexican monarchists, this read to me like a story of U.S. American monarchists and monarchical impulses within the U.S. American Catholic community.
Mhm.
For example, just thinking about the two women who kept this memory alive, right? Alice Green and Mary Louise Kearney, right? Coming from these prominent
Mhm.
families in Catholic Maryland, right? Or Washington, D.C., right? Thinking about someone like Magner himself, right? Folks like Francis C. Kelly. So to me, in many ways, Mexico is more of a mirror for the U.S. Catholic world, right? And how they're envisioning events in Mexico and how they're using that to potentially understand what they're experiencing in the 20th century and the late 19th century. So I wonder if at any point in the research that you've done, you've seen the U.S. clergy, U.S. Catholics, lay Catholics express monarchical sentiments, right? Like those akin to Mexico, right? There's that book, Conceived in Doubt, right? About the Revolutionary War, the U.S. Revolutionary War, and this kind of sense of of Christian monarchism in the
Mhm.
late 1700s, early 1800s. This response to like the deist founding fathers, Washington, Jefferson, and so on, and that persists. So I'm wondering, because to me this reads a lot like a story of U.S. monarchical impulses, and just kind of the U.S. perception and view of Mexico and Mexican politics. So that's something that I wanted to ask about. The other question is a little bit more brief. So I'm wondering, in terms of when this is all going on, if there is any sort of intentional connection between the years 1957 and 1857,
Mhm.
right? The Plan de Iguala is being put on display, right, 100 years after, the passage of the 1857 Constitution.
Mhm.
I don't know if there was an intentional connection there or not. I don't know if there was any sort of if it was just a coincidence. I mean, certainly, in Mexico with the revolutionary discourses and such, the centennial of the 1857 Constitution might have likely been something that people were talking about.
Mhm.
So I don't know if there's a coincidence with the dates there, or if there's actually some sort of intent.
Mhm.
And also in terms of the periodization, right? You fast forward right from the 1930s and 40s to the 20 teens. And I'm wondering what happened to these Mexican monarchists during the
Yeah.
Cold War, right? I think this is the question that a lot of us are asking. Where are they? I know many of our colleagues are doing research on like the neo-cristeros and the legacies of cristerismo in Cold War Mexican politics in the 1950s, 60s, and maybe even the 70s. But at least to my knowledge, it doesn't seem like any of those groups or organizations are monarchical in any way. I mean, certainly conservative and Catholic, certainly right-wing social politics, cultural politics, fiscally conservative. I mean, all these other things. But I'm kind of wondering, where have these Mexican monarchists been for the last 60 years, right? The ones who all of a sudden showed up in Washington, D.C. And of course, how much of this resurgence is a response to La Cuatro T and
Mhm.
Obradorismo? I mean,
Mhm.
we've seen this since Lopez Obrador and his election in 2018, right? I mean, part of this is the internet and social media, part of it is the pandemic, but we also see like this resurgence of ultra conservative nationalism, right, in response to La Cuatro T, very similar to what happened with Cardenismo, right, in the 1930s. So I'm curious, maybe you thought about the kind of long-term periodization of this. Um, Finally, this is just my own curiosity, right? What was CUA like in the 1950s, right? For this to be going on, for this to be such an event, right? That you had the bishop there, that you had the leaders of the university administration. I know that you mentioned in the paper that there were some Mexicans in attendance at the ceremony in 1957. Were they,
Mhm.
I mean, who were they? Were they members of the family? Were they government officials coming from the
Kind of.
embassy?
Okay. Sorry.
Right?
Yeah.
Go ahead. Yeah.
I don't think there were Mexicans at the event,
Okay.
unless I wrote that and I've completely forgotten. But I
No,
don't.
that's fine. Well, that was the question then too.
Okay.
Like, I mean, if there weren't any, I think
Yeah.
that only furthers the point of,
Yeah.
well, there really is this a story about American
American Catholics.
monarchical,
Yeah.
tendencies and, the view of Mexico from El Norte or whatever.
Hmm.
Um, and so that was something that I was thinking, just kind of like, what was the university experiencing at this time that this was such an event? Because to me, it's really, I mean, I'm not too familiar with the history of Catholic, but it's just really interesting, right? That there's this grand event occurring, right?
Yeah.
And I'm curious, well, then who was in attendance and how was this, not catalog, sorry, how was this understood or recorded or
Yeah.
reported on, by, was the student newspaper there? Was there a student newspaper
Yeah.
there?
Yeah.
Local priests there? What are they saying about the event? So on. So like I said, just
Okay.
brief questions about the
Yeah.
basics. We can talk about what to do with this, as we conversation unfolds. But thank you again. This was a wonderful presentation.
Okay, thank you. I don't think I'm going to have very satisfying answers to your questions, but I'm really glad to get them. Um, one of the reasons that one of the reasons that this story sort of has piqued my interest, I think you're exactly right that this is a story about US Catholics, and I think that's ultimately where it's probably going. Um, it's like one of the when I think about like what are the so what's, what are the really big questions that I want to deal with in this book that will someday hopefully be a book is what did what happened in Mexico mean for the US Catholic Church? And by what happened in Mexico, meaning the church state conflicts that had been going on. Of course, when I first started asking that question, I was thinking the Cristero War, the Sinarquistas, the church state conflicts after the revolution. But getting into this story has made me back up, right, and go into the 19th century and say, well, what happened with this Catholic emperor who was, and his family? What did that mean for the U.S. Catholic Church? And one of my totally sort of really, really vague hypotheses is that, well, it's not exactly vague. It's that the U.S. Catholic Church was very, very conscious. I mean, I've written about this, and you all know this, but the U.S. Catholic Church was very, very aware of what was happening in Mexico in the 1920s and 1930s, and became like, energized and activated and outraged and alarmed about the persecution, as they framed it, the persecution of Mexican Catholics. And the news of all those of the events happening in Mexico in the 1920s and 1930s really sort of galvanized a number of Catholic groups and the Catholic clergy and the Catholic hierarchy in the United States. And what I think what I think then happened is that it helped to crystallize or solidify their fear of left-wing movements around the world, right? So it directly informed, and I've written about this just a little bit, but I hope to write about it more. Like it directly informed the fact that so many Catholics supported Franco in Spain in the
Mhm.
conflict in the Spanish Civil War, right? Because they saw that there was, anytime there was a left-wing, a revolution or a left-wing movement or left-wing government, and the terms they use are different at all those, the Bolshevist or communist or whatever, the terms change over time. You see persecution of Catholics, suppression of religious freedom, and violence against, especially violence against Catholic clergy and Catholic, lay Catholics too, but Catholic clergy, Catholic religious, nuns, priests. And so the ultimate sort of big unsophisticated argument is that the conflict in Mexico helped push the U.S. church to the right in a lot of ways that remained really important throughout the 20th century and maybe even into the 21st. And then what I'll say about uh, so I know very little about what happens to monarchists. Like, what's the thread of monarchism in U.S. Catholicism over like between 1957 and 2019? I am excited to read more about this. Unlike probably most of you, I have Catholic monarchist students. And I occasionally read, like we had a grad student who's a Catholic monarchist who submitted a couple of papers, and that has been very interesting to read and sort of get a sense of what the interests are there. And one of those is about the Spanish Civil War, and another one is about Charles I, the last Habsburg emperor, and the ways that Catholics in the United States viewed him very positively and in some ways sort of venerated him. So I think there's a longer story about, I mean, I think I can connect the dots, but
Mhm.
I haven't done it yet. So anybody who wants to send me any sources about any of this, I realize, if you've come across them, please feel free. And
Mhm.
I think that it is a story about the US and the US Catholic Church, but it's also definitely a story about Mexico, right? It's a story about Mexico influencing the US
Mhm.
Catholic Church in Mexico, and what happened in Mexico influencing the US Catholic Church in some ways that I think are still around today. And
Mhm.
so I think that's the best response I can give you for now. And then, but in terms of your question about like, how was this understood at Catholic University? There were numerous people at Catholic University who had been at Catholic University and at the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops. And Catholic University is the bishops' university, right? And
Mhm.
so there are bishops kind of coming in and out. The university at that time is a really clerical university. A lot of the faculty, the staff are clergy. And so so the bishops have been very involved in the Mexican conflict, and I think there's just this sort of extra awareness of Mexico and the Mexican, their very recent past, or the very recent past of 1957, of what had been going on. I didn't say this in my presentation, but Magner, Nathan knows about this too. Magner was very, very warm towards the Sinarquistas. He really,
Mhm.
at time, then he sort of loses. I think he sort of recognizes that they're breaking up, they're not going anywhere, but he's in correspondence with Sinarquistas, kind of wondering if the Sinarquistas are going to be the organization that rescues the Catholic Church in Mexico or defends the Catholic Church in Mexico. So they're very much through Magner and then other people in the Catholic University community and the Catholic Episcopal community more broadly. They're very much aware of what's happened in Mexico and keeping an eye. They're very aware of the significance of this document and what it means for Catholicism and the Catholic Church in Mexico.
Mhm. Great.
Thank you.
Fantastic.
Thank
No,
you.
thank you. Those are wonderful answers. And I do see some hands, so I'll let some folks ask you some questions. I could take maybe 2 or 3 questions at a time. That way we can get as much participation as possible, and then we can loop back in. So, Malaki, I believe I see your hand is up. So if you'd like to go ahead and ask your question, we'll hear it.
Uh, One of the things is just to introduce myself. I was the former Claretian archivist in Chicago, and I did a dissertation at Loyola on the Protestant Catholic battle over the Mexicans. So, of course, I had to deal with this conflict between the Catholic Church and the Protestant churches. And one of the things I think that you bring up, and I think it's more a story about the United States, is the fact that in 1914, the bishops go into exile, many go to Chicago. And Kelly's big thing about them coming to Chicago is to write a proper history of the Mexican church. Because, and people don't know it, like Hubert Herring was a Protestant minister and head of the Congregational Church. So it was always a Protestant perspective that kind of dominated this American scholarship. So he wanted to do that. Needless to say, the book wasn't written till later, and I guess it was Bishop Plancarte, I forget where he's from, on leaving the Newberry, because they did all the work at the Newberry Library, gave the Newberry Library the first printed book in the Americas
Mm,
as a
that,
gift.
wow. Oh, wow.
And
Oh,
that's buried. I
yeah,
had the reference to it, and it's just buried. They didn't even know they had it.
that's amazing. That's great. So Magner was, I'm trying to find my paper and see where Magner was from exactly, but he's from Illinois. He's definitely got a Chicago connection.
Oh
He,
yeah.
right, when he writes his book, he says, like, this is the first and only book to be written about Mexico from the Catholic
Oh,
perspective, which we
absolutely.
know is not true,
Mhm.
because
Right.
other people had been doing, other Catholics, Kelly and Wilfred Parsons had been writing earlier,
Yeah.
but he was selling it to a publisher, so we know how that goes.
So Orozco and Jimenez lives with Kelly at St. Joseph's in Wilmette.
Yeah, I
So
remember
that's where he
that.
resides when he's in exile.
I actually didn't remember to look and see if Magner. I mean, I have to. Oh, this is the other thing. The Magner papers are uncatalogued. So they are 40 boxes at the CUA archives. We've applied for a federal grant to catalog them, but we're probably not going to get it because
Hmm.
federal money is not happening these days. So what I found from the Magner archives was like my best guess of his papers, and what I found was mixed in with like old stock certificates and his rental agreements and passports, and so that was a fun archival experience that I know you all can uh
The other interesting thing that I think is important in this discussion is during the 1920s, you have this anti-Catholic movement. I think Oregon, you have the school case where they don't want Catholic schools. But also during the 1920s, there's the Smith-Townsend Act. And the only reason I know that because I was at St. Anselm and I was the archivist there. And the monks kept on writing about the dangers of the Smith-Townsend Act, which would have created the Department of Education, which they were petrified of because it would give, would regulate Catholic schools, and they were kind of free of that depending on the state. So the big thing is really to combat this whole idea of Mexicans, taking over the educational functions of the state. And
Yeah.
that's the underlying tension. And I think it's more about the Catholic Church wanting acceptance
Mhm.
in society because they're a minority church
Yeah.
still
Mhm.
than the Mexicans. They use it, they kind of say this might happen to you or something.
Right.
Yeah.
And I think that is the underlying tension. It's more about saying them this could happen to you.
Huh. Yeah. Yeah. Well, which they still do. I mean, I've presented on that. I'm back in, what was it, like 2011 or 2012, and I presented on the history of the Cristero War to the Catholic Daughters of the Americas, and one of them came up after and said, this is going to happen in the United States. It's a slippery slope. It was
Mm.
like, and it was because it was Obamacare. Obamacare at the time, was the
Yeah.
slippery slope that was going to result in the total restriction of religious freedom in the United States. And it was really useful to me to hear that argument and I think that's similarly, of course, what's happening in Mexico is influencing the US Catholic Church, and they're also seeing it through the lens of their own experiences in the United States
Right.
and their own fears about world politics in other places.
Mhm. Mhm.
Yeah.
So,
And
Those
they're
are just
using it.
something because I didn't discuss that, but I came across that and it was very strong.
hmm.
Mhm.
And this whole idea of who controls the scholarship of Mexico at the time.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and
Mhm.
everybody loves to, even then and still now, people talk about the way that this is like a forgotten story. It's a repressed story that nobody knows this history, and it's really important for us to tell this story. And I mean, I think that's true on one level, and then on the other level, they're all talking about this history all the time. So it's not that
Mhm.
nobody knows it, but
Mhm.
um,
Mhm.
but they're conscious of the fact that like this is a story. It's a what's the word like there's a utilitarianism, or I'm not sure if
Mhm.
that's the word I'm going for, but like they're telling the story for a reason.
Yeah.
Um,
Right.
it's 7:53 here, so I'm gonna run out of vocabulary.
There's a question that's on the chat that I'm going to read out loud so everyone can hear it, and people who are watching us on YouTube can hear it later. Before I do though, I mean, I agree a lot with what Malachi's saying. Even in my own research, I've seen this. Like, folks in the U.S. are leaning on the Cristero War to make these claims about freedom, democracy, right, liberty of conscience, liberty of expression, religious expression. It's the way that they become American, right? At a time when Catholics are being accused of being un-American. They're like, well, look at us. Like, we're the ones who are actually speaking out against this, persecution that, violates everything that we believe in, and, in the US context. And so they use this as a way to essentially like really bolster their own sense of American identity, right? US American identity, when it is a predominantly immigrant church that is, being accused by many of being, papist conspirators, right? Among other things. But I do want to read this before we get off track. Dominic Guerrero asks on the chat, I really enjoy physical exhibits, but they're often limited to a specific location. Unless we're in the area, we miss the opportunity to experience them. Given how fascinating this history is, especially for audiences in Mexico and Latin America, have you considered creating a digital version of the exhibit? With all the primary sources and images you've collected, a visualized online exhibit could be a powerful way to share this history more widely. You might even consider presenting it in both Spanish and English to reach a broader audience, right? And so that's Dominic's questions. I know, Dominic, you're here also in the chat, but I'll go
Right.
ahead and let Julia.
Sounds like we've got a project, is all I'll say. I mean, it sounds like what I would love is for someone to come and hang out with me in the archives in the summer and do some work on these Magner papers, because I think there's a lot more. So this is I put this in my paper, but he was in communication with like really key figures in the Cristero War, and this is starting in the 1930s. He really goes and gets connected to like very key, important Catholic activists in Mexico City, and then he stays in correspondence with him. So in his files are, like endless postcards of martyred Catholics from the Cristero War, but also like I don't even know what they were. They're sort of like they're not microfilms, but they're something like that, sort of microfilm documents that are letters like that I've seen in other archives in Mexico. He has somebody's got to help me, and I can't believe I'm forgetting this name, but I think maybe I can find it. But he is in regular correspondence with the former head of the Liga, somebody.
Palomar
Paloma y
Vizcarra.
Vizcarra, thank you.
Yeah.
So, and at some point, Paloma y Vizcarra like sends him a huge collection of his papers. I think because maybe he was thinking of writing a book on the Cristero War. He never did that. But so it's actually a really and then of course he develops all these connections to the Iturbide family and to this other like subset of disaffected Catholics with with a real and imagined past in Mexico. So he manages to get himself remarkably connected. He says he was good at languages and he learned Spanish. His autobiography, which is a 2-volume, extremely detailed autobiography, is also in the archives and in the CUA library. So he talks about these trips to Mexico. And so anyway, there are a lot of treasures in the archives and possibly even actual treasures because I didn't have time to look at whether any of the stock certificates had any value, but those are there too. So maybe that should be a motivation for someone to come and join me. And then we put together, we can pull out some of these really interesting visual sources that are scattered across the 40 boxes. And then of course I never figured out. So from the beginning of the time I got to Catholic, there were a couple people in the archives and others who knew of this who were like, the Plan de Iturbide is there and the Iturbide papers are there and you have to do something with this. And I was like, yeah, but I do Cristeros and that's not really connected, right? And joke's on me because now I need to go figure out what happened in the 19th century and like connect the dots to tell this story. And this might be the best I can ever do with it, but clearly the story starts, we know the story starts before 1926, right? So it's interesting. I had never encountered, apart from this group of would-be rebels on the border who called themselves the Army of the Three Guarantees, I hadn't encountered that much about Iturbide in my research on Cristeros. There's more, I think, in the Sinarquista literature, and again, Nathan, I'll turn it over to Nathan in a second, but just knowing that this family was still alive and around and in Mexico and in the United States while the religious conflict was happening in the 1920s just adds this whole other dimension for me anyway, that of interest.
Great,
So,
thank you.
yeah, thank you.
Nathan, go ahead. You've had your hand up for a little while.
Thanks so much. And first off, Julia, what an interesting work. Really enjoyed this. I really had no clue about like the descendants of Iturbide and in all the transnational connections with the United States. I think kind of to Ricardo's point earlier, I think that's what's really fascinating is this is not only a Mexican story, but this is truly a transnational story with the United States. And I always just find it interesting, my own personal interest about how you have folks from Mexico in exile in the United States. And this is like people across the political spectrum,
Really?
right?
Yeah.
Which I think is super fascinating, right? So we oftentimes, I think, there's this focus of like the left wingers in the context of the United States. I think about like Ricardo Flores Magón and all those folks. But then, of course, you have folks like the Iturbides and beyond who are in the United States. And of course, Porfirio Diaz was in exile in the United States too. So it's interesting thinking about all of that. All that being said, and so those are all the different things I find interesting. But I am curious about this kind of Sinarquista connection and looking at at your paper, right? It seems like Magner seems to be kind of the linchpin that connects the Sinarquistas to these folks. Yeah. But I'd like to hear a little more from you about that connection. And I could just to what you asked earlier, just kind of a moment ago, about was there any support for monarchists? I never saw, like, I mean, I think, of course, El Anarquista had these sections where they're kind of honoring these past like conservative leaders, like
Yeah.
they had that whole spread, I think, that you and I talked about, where they like kind of put them up on a pedestal, and this is this person we need to honor in our
Yeah.
past. But I never see them directly say that they want Mexican monarchy.
No. Yeah.
So that's
No.
to that point. But yeah, anyways, I'm just curious about the connection between these folks and the Sinarquistas beyond Magna, or if you can elaborate a little bit, that'd be great.
No,
But
I mean, you and
ultimately,
I, Nathan, are going to make another Zoom conversation date, and you're going to answer that question for me. But because you wrote about Magner, you did work on, as much, if not more, work on Magner as I did, and he's uh and I'm still trying to figure out. Well, I mean, that's my biggest question with this piece of writing, actually, is does it, where does it go? Does it go into the book somehow? But then I have to rip it apart because I'm, trying to tell this story of the Sinarquistas and the way that the US Catholic Church and the way that different groups of people see the Sinarquistas. So where does this story go? Because it's both an older story. I mean, you can see I have these different time periods mushed together, right? It's this older story of the 19th century and very early 20th century. And then it's this later story of the 1950s, 30s, 40s, and 50s with Magner. And then somehow working out, the like going into the depths of the internet and realizing that, like, oh, there are people who know exactly where all the Iturbide descendants are today. Like, there are family trees of living Iturbide descendants. There's one in Europe and there's another in Mexico, and none of them are interested in trying to come up and be a new emperor of Mexico at this point, according to those websites that track them. So, so, uh, yeah, so I don't know how it fits yet. I mean, I think so. Magner, this is going to be fresher in your mind than mine, maybe. Magner's in touch with I mean, he knows about the Sinarquistas and Abascal. He's in touch with someone. I think there's a correspondence between him. I looked at this years ago and then I haven't been back to it. There's a correspondence between him and a Sinarquista in Mexico City in like 1944, after the Sinarquistas have already broken up. I think, if I'm remembering that correctly. But I think you and I should like get together and geek out about this and what this means for the Sinarquista story. And then in terms of how it fits in with the Sinarquista story, or maybe what I'm writing isn't just a story about the Sinarquistas, and it's a larger story about Mexico and its religious conflict and the ways that it's viewed in by different people in the United States. Because at the same time that Magner and US Catholics are are writing about the Sinarquistas in the 1940s and are celebrating the Iturbide papers in the 1950s, there are journalists and left-wing writers and artists and novelists writing about the repressive, creepy Catholic Church and its backwards rituals and how it's trying to undermine the agrarian revolution in Mexico, right? So it's contested. It's the meaning of all of this is contested in the United States, and it's contested by different people in the United States. And then, of course, it's also contested by, as you pointed out in the beginning, different groups of Mexicans in the United States, right? Like, not everyone who comes to, I mean, I know I wrote a book about Cristero migrants in the United States, or migrants who supported the Cristeros in the United States, but I tried to write in that book that they were fighting with other Mexicans in the United States who were leftist, who supported the revolution. Okay, I think that answer was a mess, but we'll continue to workshop it.
That was great. Ricardo, can I just add a super quick follow-up comment? I'll make it real quick. I mean, in terms of what you can do, this is another thing I just really wanted to say when I was asking the question as well. But yeah, thank you for that response. But I think in terms of what you can do with this work, initially I was thinking, right, it doesn't have to necessarily be part of the book. It could be a separate book, right? I mean, this could be a future work down the road. I know that sounds like a lot of work, but I'm thinking, if nothing else.
Deborah says no, so I can't.
Okay. Well, I think if nothing else, I think at least an article. Like, I think
it might be
I would love to read an article about this. And
this being actually an article geared towards a more popular readership. like not a horror article,
Yeah.
like something sort of more
Yeah.
popular, maybe Catholic. I don't know what that America's
No,
Quarterly does that you just published in.
I don't
That
think
seems
they
to
want a
be
7,000 word piece. That's the problem. It's sort of but
okay.
but maybe they do. I'm open
We
to
could do something collective on Iturbidismo since it shows up in so many of our
Yes.
Mhm.
work and so many of the people who we study, right? I mean, I
Mhm.
see it all the time in my archives and the people who I write about.
Okay, well,
You know,
my
that
piece
makes
is
Por
three.
favor.
great. All right, let's hear
I see that Matthew's been waiting patiently with his hand up, so I'll go ahead and let him ask. Thank you, Matthew, for waiting for us, and we'll take a listen.
Yeah, no, it's a really fascinating story you have there, Julia, and the conversation's really been about the relevance of this story to the kind of religious crisis in Mexico and its ramifications in the US. I think the 19th century part of the story, like the Porfirista bit, is also really interesting. And I'd love to know more about that. And what does Diaz think of Iturbide? Does he mention him in his voluminous archives? Do they ever correspond? Who are all those people that support Iturbide in his like doomed attempt to return to Mexico? There's a perennial fascination with defeated monarchies,
Yeah.
Mary, Queen of Scots, and Bonnie Prince Charlie, and
Yeah.
Kings of Portugal, all of that kind of thing. So your paper might be at another level, like a history of that kind of like impulse in Mexico. The pretender tradition.
Yeah.
There are lots of them in Mexico. They're not always monarchists. Felix Diaz, Benito Juarez Massa. Sometimes those people can like cause real trouble.
Mhm.
And it's interesting on that score. And maybe there's like another lesson about the Porfiriato and the need for a mystique of power as well as actual power. And
Mhm.
maybe that's something that the regime didn't have enough of, and that left some room for somebody like Iturbide to appear in all his tragic glory.
Thank you, Matthew. I'm writing down notes. I don't know if I'll be able to, well, I hope I will be able to go to the Porfirio Diaz archives, which I've never been to, but
Mhm. It's
luckily,
at Ibero, right?
yeah, actually, I
Mhm.
have been there. I've been in the room, but I haven't done research there. But luckily at Catholic, well, Agustin Iturbide Green or someone in his family kept these beautiful scrapbooks with every article written about him in Mexico and in the United States during this episode when he returned to Mexico and then until he was put in prison in Mexico. So there's at least a good and I really just skimmed that for this paper, but that's almost a chapter in itself. So Deborah's going to get mad, but yeah, maybe this is an even longer project, but it's almost a chapter in itself because it's a story about Porfirio in Mexico, and it's about was this a moment where uh where people were begin because this is earlier. I mean, he's now I already forget the year that I told you all that this happened. But this is way before the revolution, right? This is maybe a moment where there's a monarchist, there are people sort of flirting with a monarchist replacement for Porfirio in the 1880s and 1870s, right? Or 1890s, which I said he was 30 years old. So yeah, 1890s. Um, so there is a story there, and I can at least hopefully over the summer go back into those nicely organized scrapbooks. Apparently, the archivist told me that this is something that prominent people would do. Maybe you've seen these, but they would pay like a clipping service to collect all the clippings about them and then compile them into scrapbooks. And it's really nice for historians who want to know where someone appeared in the press. So I appreciate whoever did that in the
Mhm.
past. Hi,
Great.
Teresita.
Go ahead, Teresita.
Hi, so I am super late. I was listening in my car on YouTube while I was driving back from a meeting from campus. All of this is incredibly new to me because what I know about it, and I know that Julie and I have had conversations, is all based on cultural memory and stories that I hear from within my own family that oftentimes do not parallel historical evidence whatsoever. And I find that very fascinating. But one of the things that I remember my grandmother talking about was saying that if it weren't for the fall of a monarchy in Mexico, the Catholic Church wouldn't have created social programs to even care about the poor. And so, but then people would talk about how within the Porfiriato, it was basically just another monarchy called by a different name, and especially during like the long reign. And so I don't know if you have any thoughts on kind of that. There's like just a memory that I have of her talking about it and said like the fall of the monarchy is what basically and our move toward independence was what got the church even caring about the poor, because they were the only people that could build the church back up, or they were the people that were the church. And I don't know if there's anything in the archives that you've seen from perspectives of lower class congregants or people who had specific feelings about monarchismo, like in Mexico, and how it relates to the church's social involvement with the community.
Yeah, I don't know. That's really interesting. And what you made me think of was in the connecting was this your grandmother?
Yeah, this is my grandmother,
Yeah.
but she was like she was a lot older when she had my dad, so she was
Yeah.
a child during the Cristero
Wow.
movement. So this was later, like she was definitely not alive during this period. She was just
No.
telling me her perspective on things.
Yeah. Well, you just made me flash to that my memories. Well, the Castillo de Chapultepec is one of my favorite places in Mexico City, and walking through there and seeing the amazing, beautiful, fancy gilded carriages and rooms that belonged to Maximilian and Carlota and then belonged to Porfirio Diaz, right? And you have this kind of, so there is maybe there is a sort of I don't know. I mean, I don't think Porfirio, I don't know enough to say that Porfirio Diaz was or wasn't, had a monarchist aesthetic or not, but maybe there's some connection. I mean, even just in the fact that they all live in the Castillo de Chapultepec. So but I don't know. It's really interesting to think about how to get at like popular conceptions of, and I just literally just don't know this history, but popular conceptions of, I don't know. I mean, Iturbide, Maximilian and Carlota, the Iturbide, the Agustin Iturbide Green, that story. I think I will look for that I look for that sort of crossways when I go back into those newspaper archives, although I'm pretty sure the newspaper collection is going to tell me what, educated, literate elites thought about the whole thing. So, but I'll see.
Yeah, no, and what I have to share with you is mostly song-based, because that's how the popular community viewed, the monarchy viewed Carlota, and like one of the most famous things that my grandma would sing were all songs about Carlota. But anyways, we can talk later. But this is so fascinating, Julia. Thank you.
Thank you, Teresita.
I keep seeing Ben with like a hand emoji. I don't know, Ben, if that means you're raising your hand. It looks different than the Zoom hand. I'm not sure. I don't want to skip over any questions. So if you have questions, please feel free to ask away. And Nathan tells me that Andres also had a question earlier. Andres, I see that you're still here. Do you also want to ask your question?
With that?
Más que nada, a partir de lo que estaban comentando, me salieron algunas dudas, porque lo que tenía ya lo contestaron, pero hablo muy mal en mi inglés, Ricardo. Entonces,
Está bien. Si quieres.
No pasa nada, en español está bien. Adelante.
Está
Sí,
bien.
aquí. Ajá.
Súper genial. Bueno, Julia, muchas felicidades por la presentación, por la investigación. Es un texto muy interesante porque a fin de cuentas tenemos que recordar, y perdón para los que no hablen español, Agustín de Iturbide para los mexicanos pues es una figura obscura. Y la familia de Iturbide es todavía más desconocida. Y si bien es cierto que nosotros tenemos a veces nociones de lo que pasó con los Iturbide, realmente no tenemos una idea clara de cuál fue su destino, porque a fin de cuentas la educación de la posrevolución condenó a Iturbide a ser uno de los malos y por lo tanto su familia pagó también ese precio dentro del contexto histórico. Al final, a mí me llama mucho la atención el título de tu investigación porque en México no existen los títulos nobiliarios. Y desde esa perspectiva, en el momento en que Iturbide cayó, pues nadie debería haber conservado ningún tipo de título. Y sin embargo, lo que presentas a través de tus postulados es que al final hay un imaginario que guarda esta idea de una realeza mexicana. Una realeza que se va a continuar no solo por Iturbide, sino por el Segundo Imperio, que adopta a los hijos de Iturbide, que a partir de eso, pues se convierten en el eslabón perdido de la monarquía, el conservadurismo, ese proyecto monárquico que termina con la muerte de Maximiliano, con el fusilamiento a Maximiliano. Y sin embargo, esa idea en México después de la posrevolución o con la posrevolución, pues se vuelve prácticamente negativa. En México no hay imperio, no hay nobleza. Y aún así queda como símbolo de una, no sé si de toda la Iglesia Católica en México o de una parte de la Iglesia y de los católicos mexicanos, porque al final me llamaba la atención en el texto. Tú dices que es una figura importante durante el porfiriato, pero joder, la Iglesia Católica durante el porfiriato pues no estuvo nada mal. Pues no tendría por qué haber ese elemento que nos dijera, vamos a rescatar la figura de Iturbide. A lo mejor es el imaginario. Y sí, coincido con algunos de los comentarios. Esto parece más bien como la Iglesia Católica estadounidense, y a mí me llama la atención, al ser minoritaria, encuentra estos elementos en la Iglesia Católica o en el catolicismo, en el conservadurismo mexicano, para decir, a ver, aquí estamos para defender, enarbolando a lo mejor tales elementos o tales banderas, pero como somos minoría en Estados Unidos, pues nos vamos a auxiliar a la Iglesia Católica, que se supone que es mayoría ahí en México, y aún así la está pasando mal. Y me gustaría saber, nada más como pregunta, ¿qué tan agradecidos, si es que lo sabes, estuvieron los obispos mexicanos con la ayuda de la Iglesia Católica estadounidense? Porque los obispos mexicanos siempre han sido, pues, muy suyos. Entonces, ¿les ayudó? ¿Les quedaron agradecidos con esta ayuda de la Iglesia Católica estadounidense, con la participación o el envío de dinero y cuestiones así
Ah,
durante
sí.
el gobierno, el problema del culto religioso en México, la prohibición del culto religioso? Pareciera en muchas ocasiones que a la Iglesia Católica Mexicana no le gusta que se intervenga, y a fin de cuentas eso se demuestra cuando pues, consigue el acuerdo del modus vivendi con el gobierno mexicano. Entonces, qué tan relacionados estaban el episcopado mexicano y el episcopado de Estados Unidos?
Ah,
Gracias.
ok, gracias por tus comentarios y la pregunta. Brevemente, en mis libros en Mexican Exodus, que lamentablemente no he podido traducir a español todavía, lo siento mucho, pero algún día lo haré.
Ahí
Eh,
está ChatGPT, para eso no te preocupes.
sí, exacto. Ok, somebody put it into ChatGPT.
Yeah.
Pero escribo mucho acerca de la historia de los obispos mexicanos exiliados en Estados Unidos y qué tan duro trabajaron a conseguir el apoyo de la iglesia y de los obispos de los Estados Unidos. Y estaban súper, bueno, me imagino que su territorialismo, si esto es una buena palabra, desapareció un poco durante los años de guerra, ¿no? Porque estaban desesperados para conseguir toda la ayuda que podían, toda la publicidad que podían y dinero, propaganda, etcétera. Entonces trabajaron muy de cerca con varios obispos y otras personas de la Iglesia Católica en Estados Unidos. Y sobre los títulos, esta princesa o princesa, ella se insistió en mantener el título Her Imperial Highness, which I don't know how to actually translate that. But she was referred to as Her Imperial Highness in
Su
articles.
Alteza, Su Alteza
Alteza
Imperial.
Imperial, sí.
Imperial.
Alteza Imperial.
Ujú.
Esta persona como viuda que vivió sola en un departamento pequeña en un vecindario no tan fancy en Washington, D.C., mantuvo el título Alteza Imperial, que no sé, me impresionó mucho acerca de ella. Y al final, sí, hay otro sitio sobre el hecho de que esto es una historia olvidada o una historia no bien conocida en México. Hay un sitio en Washington que se llama the Mexican Cultural Institute, Instituto Cultural Mexicano, y un parte de la embajada aquí en México, pero es el edificio es la embajada anterior, antigua de México. Y es una casona muy grande con murales muy bonitas que fueron pintadas en los años 40 y relatan la historia de México. Las murales y incluyen bonito, Benito Juárez, a Simón Bolívar, México y las Américas. Em, eh, bueno, la historia de México, varias figuras no incluyen nada acerca de la Iglesia Católica, ni imágenes por supuesto, de Agustín de Iturbide. Entonces, hay como una historia mayoritaria o común que relata el gobierno mexicano y hay estas historias olvidadas que son importantes de estudiar, supongo. So that was the best I could do on that question, but I hope,
Sí.
espero que uh, le he dado o te he dado como algo en que una respuesta más o menos interesante al menos. Gracias.
Muchas gracias. Y nada más antes de continuar, entiendo entonces que estos personajes que tú estudias no tuvieron hijos.
¿Cuáles? Sí, el último emperador o el Agustín Iturbide Green.
Ajá.
Sí, no tuvieron hijos, pero otros tuvieron, o él tuvo primos, muchos primos, del lado de sus varios hermanos en Estados Unidos. Y
Porque
algunos regresaron a México, entonces había una familia grande. Y hay
Maximiliano
descendientes.
adopta dos niños, ¿no?
¿Cómo?
Maximiliano adopta dos de los hijos de Iturbide.
¿Quién? O
Maximiliano.
Maximiliano, sí, 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 sí.
Y se supone que el actual heredero vive en Australia, ¿no? No sé si sabes eso.
No sé.
Se
Pero
supone que
si quieres la información, por favor, mándemela.
también está como en internet, pero se supone que el actual heredero, así como de la corona mexicana, es
Ah,
un granjero australiano.
ok, fascinante.
Sí.
Hay que entrevistarlo.
Gracias.
Muchas gracias, Andrés. Y bueno, ya estamos por terminar. Creo que algo muy valioso en tu pregunta es también esta idea de que, bueno, al menos algo que yo he visto mucho en mi investigación también, que no todos los iturbidistas son monarquistas. También es algo muy raro, porque es la imagen del emperador Iturbide, pero sobre todo hablando de Iturbide como alguien que le dio a la Iglesia Católica su lugar en la sociedad
Mm,
mexicana, pero en sí no necesariamente yéndose tanto al extremo eh, de exigir el regreso de la monarquía,
sí,
aunque a lo mejor es como como que aquí decimos en inglés un fine line, ¿no? Es ahí un poco medio grisecillo el tema, pero se me hace muy buena esa pregunta, ¿no? Porque tienes toda la razón. En México hay esta aversión hacia las
sí,
monarquías, los títulos de nobleza, etcétera. Y aún así, muchos católicos mexicanos, a lo mejor no son enteramente monarquistas, pero siguen siendo iturbidistas, ¿no? Jugando con este imaginario del emperador y el legado del primer imperio.
sí.
Pero
Y
bueno,
he oído que también hay descendientes de Maximiliano en la Ciudad de México.
ujú.
Este monarquista mexicano que vino a la Catholic University para arreglar este evento con el plan de Iguala, me dijo que estaba en contacto con el no sé quién, bisnieto, no sé qué, de Maximiliano. Entonces, sí, pero supongo que hay sí, como dices, Ricardo, hay turbidistas monarquistas y no monarquistas y yo sería muy interesada en hablar a cualquier iturbidista que podemos encontrar.
Gracias, Julia. Andrés, ¿quieres aportar algo más antes de cerrar la sesión?
Ah, bueno, nietos de Maximiliano imposible, porque la sífilis no le permitió tener hijos, pero de
Oh,
sus...
sí, 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 perdón. No, no, no me acuerdo. Descendientes de su familia, pero
Sí,
no.
sí. De hecho, supuestamente los últimos monarcas Habsburgo viven en México, en San Ángel.
Ok, ok. En San
Mira,
Ángel.
Ajá.
Ok.
interesante. Vamos a hacer un mapping, un proyecto de mapping. No, eso está muy bueno el
Sí.
dato. Este, Pero bueno, pues le damos las gracias we thank Julia Young for being here. Muchas gracias también a todas las personas que asistieron a este evento, que hicieron sus preguntas durante el encuentro también. Teresita, Dominic, Nathan y bueno, aquellos que también estuvieron aquí y se fueron. Antes de irnos, el breve anuncio parroquial, just really quick before we leave. Tuesday, May 13th, Julia will also be participating, as will I, in a virtual workshop happening across 2 continents and maybe 6 or 7 different time zones. The title of this project is The Politics of Mexican Catholic Visual Culture, Propaganda, Mobilization, and Memory. It's part of a special issue that Lucio Sullivan, Gemma, and Julia are coordinating with the Bulletin for Latin American Research, right? That's the name of the journal?
Yes, BLAR.
Yes. LAR, yeah, that's how I remember.
I just think of it as
Um,
BLAR.
Yeah, and Nathan has mentioned and reminded everyone that we have shared this through the email list and will continue to do so. Just for reference, it's happening at 8 in the morning in Ciudad de Mexico and New Mexico. It's happening at 9 a.m. US Central, 10 a.m. US Eastern, and 3 p.m. Ireland and UK. So certainly a transcontinental effort here. Anyone who would like to join us is welcome to be part of it. Anything you'd like to add on that, Julia, before we leave?
No, just I'm looking forward to getting that paper in shape to share. And there should be some pretty good that should be a conference with some really good images for people. Dominic, you'll be if you could it says you'll say you'll be there, that's wonderful. And there
Yeah.
should be lots of good stuff to look at. So
Yeah. Fantastic. Well, thank you, everybody. Have a great night. Enjoy. And thank you also for just joining us this whole year of HISCATMEX programming. This is officially our last event. So Nathan, thank you also for co-hosting with myself, keeping the Seminario afloat. We'll be in touch over the summer with some news about next year's Seminario and potential events that we're going to be doing. Nate, will you want to add something on that?
Just super quick, I just wanted to thank everyone for another great year of HISCATMEX programming. So we've been doing this we're about to have our 5-year anniversary this year, which is super exciting. And I just wanted to do a shout out for that. 5 years, and we've been mainly doing this virtual and remotes and connecting.
It's like we have a kindergartner.
I know. It's pretty phenomenal. So, just connecting scholars in Mexico with the United States and Canada and United Kingdom and beyond. And so this is just really exciting. I just wanted to make a point of just saying that we can't do this without all of you. So thank you so much to all of you for making this possible. Gracias a todos.
thank you guys for building this community.
Yes, certainly. And it keeps growing.
Yeah.
So thank you all for everything. Everyone have a good night. We'll see each other soon.
Bye, guys.